Sound of distant bombs, women clutching their children as the ground trembles. A mother whispers a prayer, expecting death. But instead of soldiers with rifles, American doctors walk in, with medicine, food, and kindness. In the ashes of war, where hope had vanished, compassion rose from the very hands once called the enemy. After World War II, Japan lay in ruins, its people starving, its spirit broken. Many Japanese mothers believed their lives were over, their children doomed to suffering. But when American doctors, nurses, and volunteers arrived, they didn't bring punishment. They brought healing. What happened next changed the heart of a nation forever.
Japan's defeat in 1945 was not just military. It was emotional, spiritual, and human. Cities turned to rubble, fathers lost, and mothers left with no food or medicine. Many women believed death was better than watching their children starve. But in that darkness, something unexpected appeared. The very nation they feared began to rebuild what was broken. The end of the war was not a moment of peace. It was the beginning of a silence so heavy that it suffocated even the sound of hope. Across Japan, the once bustling cities now stood as empty shells, their streets filled with the echo of loss. The firebombings had not only destroyed buildings, but also burned away the very essence of security and identity. Families huddled together in makeshift shelters, built from whatever scraps could be found among the ashes. Mothers clutched their children tightly at night, whispering lullabies that carried no promise of tomorrow. The scent of smoke and despair lingered in the air long after the last bomb had fallen. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, and disease crept through the ruins, silent and merciless. For many, survival itself began to feel like a form of cruelty. Yet, amidst that devastation, life refused to surrender completely. A flicker of resilience remained, fragile but alive. It came first as rumors. Stories spread through the villages and shattered towns. Foreigners, the same ones who had dropped bombs, were arriving, not with weapons, but with supplies. Many could not believe it. The Americans, some whispered, their voices trembling. Why would they come here now? To finish what they started? Fear ran deep. The wounds of war had cut through the soul of an entire nation. The propaganda of years past had painted the Americans as monsters, heartless invaders who would destroy everything sacred. Mothers had told their children to hide, to bite their tongues, to never look a foreign soldier in the eyes. And yet, as the first American trucks rolled into broken villages, they did not bring death. They brought milk powder, blankets, medicine, and gentle hands. For the women who had nothing left, this sight was more shocking than any explosion. American doctors stepped carefully among the rubble, their faces covered in dust and sweat. They worked not with orders to conquer, but with the simple mission to heal. They treated burns, set broken bones, and nursed malnourished children back to life. One Japanese mother would later write in her diary, "I had prepared to die. I thought no one would ever help us. But the enemy saved my son. I do not understand this kindness, but it feels like the world has changed." These small moments of compassion rippled through the ruins like a soft wind. Slowly, the barriers built by war began to crumble. A new kind of rebuilding had begun, not of steel and concrete, but of trust. For many Japanese women, this compassion felt almost unreal. They had spent years under a government that glorified sacrifice and silence, where surrender was considered shameful and tears were hidden behind bowed heads. But now, these same women found themselves being comforted by those they once feared. American nurses, many barely older than the women they treated, listened to their stories, held their babies, and spoke gently even when they could not understand the language. Through touch and kindness, they communicated something that no words could express: forgiveness without being asked, love without condition. The children were the first to adapt. Their fear faded faster than their mothers. They were curious about the smiling strangers who brought them chocolate and taught them simple English words. In the eyes of these children, a bridge began to form. A fragile but powerful connection between two worlds once torn apart by hatred. Each shared laugh, each small act of kindness was a stone laid upon that bridge. Yet for many adults, the emotional transformation came slowly, painfully. The memories of bombings, the sight of loved ones buried under ruins, the nights spent trembling in fear, all of it was still too close. Forgiveness is not born easily from such suffering. But day after day, as they watched the Americans work tirelessly to heal the sick and feed the hungry, something began to shift. The idea of the enemy grew blurred, replaced by something deeply human. In one small village, an American doctor helped deliver a baby under a torn roof. The mother, too weak to speak, could only cry. When the newborn cried for the first time, the entire room fell silent. The doctor smiled and gently placed the child in her arms. "She will live," he said softly. That single moment carried more power than any victory parade. It was proof that compassion could rise even from the ashes of destruction. Across Japan, similar scenes unfolded in schools turned into hospitals, in temples converted into shelters. Doctors and nurses worked beside Japanese volunteers, sharing tools, food, and laughter. The mothers who had once thought of death now began to think of rebuilding. They learned again how to dream, not just for survival, but for a better future for their children. They began planting small gardens, repairing homes, teaching their children to read. Hope returned, quietly but firmly. It was not the kind of hope that shouts, it was the kind that endures. America's aid was not perfect, nor was it without tension. Misunderstandings and mistrust lingered, as they often do between those once divided by war. But beneath it all, there was a growing recognition of shared humanity. Both nations had lost too much to continue hating. And it was often the women, the mothers, who led the emotional recovery. Their hearts, broken yet unyielding, became symbols of renewal. They embodied a truth older than any nation or flag, that the instinct to nurture, to protect life, is stronger than any weapon ever forged. In their kitchens, even with little to cook, they found ways to make meals stretch a bit further. They shared what they little had with neighbors, and even strangers. They told their children that kindness was the new form of strength, that gratitude was not weakness, but grace. And slowly, a generation grew up without the bitterness their parents had carried. Those children would become the architects, teachers, and dreamers of a new Japan, one built not on war, but on cooperation. Years later, historians would call this period the miracle of Reconstruction. But for the women who lived it, the miracle was not in the factories or roads, it was in the small, quiet victories. The sound of laughter returning to a home, the sight of a healed child, the moment a woman looked at an American nurse and no longer saw an enemy. The miracle was that after everything, humanity had survived. Even the American soldiers were changed by what they saw. Many had come expecting hostility, but instead found courage and dignity in the people they had once fought. They wrote letters home describing the Japanese mothers who thanked them with deep bows, tears streaming down their faces. Some soldiers would never forget those encounters. They carried them for the rest of their lives as proof that even after war, decency can endure. By the early 1950s, Japan was rising again, not through power, but through peace. The country rebuilt its schools, its industries, and its spirit with remarkable speed. And at the heart of that rebirth were the same women who had once stood ready to die. They became teachers of endurance, living reminders that even the deepest pain can give birth to strength. They told their children about the day they met the Americans who came not with guns, but with open hands. They spoke of how kindness had turned strangers into saviors. Through them, the story of post-war Japan became more than a tale of recovery. It became a lesson in the boundless resilience of the human heart. In every nation, across every generation, there are moments when despair feels final, when hatred feels eternal. But history has shown, again and again, that compassion has a way of breaking through even the hardest walls. The story of those Japanese mothers and the Americans who helped them stands as living proof. It reminds us that peace is not signed on paper. It is built in moments of mercy. It is born in the decision to care even when the world tells you not to. Japan's defeat was devastating, but in that defeat lay the seed of something greater than victory: understanding. The women who once prepared to die ended up giving birth to a new vision of life, one defined not by enemies or borders, but by humanity itself. In their courage to accept help, and in the Americans' courage to offer it, a bridge was built that still stands today. It connects not just two nations, but every soul who believes that even after the darkest of nights, there is always light waiting to return.
When U.S. medical teams arrived, many Japanese civilians hid, terrified of revenge. Instead, the Americans set up clinics, delivered food, and treated the wounded. They didn't see enemies. They saw mothers, infants, and suffering souls. This act of mercy shattered years of hatred. One mother wrote, "The enemy saved my baby. My tears were no longer of fear, but of gratitude." The first few days after the American teams entered Japanese towns were filled with silence, the kind that hangs heavy in the air when hearts are unsure whether to trust or run. The sound of boots on broken streets echoed through alleys, and behind torn shoji doors, families held their breath. They had heard stories, terrifying ones, about what occupying armies might do. Women held their children close, ready to flee into the forest or swallow their fear if soldiers came knocking. But instead of commands or violence, they heard something else entirely: the soft tone of an American doctor asking for the sick, the crying, the starving. They heard the clatter of metal as field hospitals were assembled, the hum of generators powering lights in buildings that had been dark for months. Slowly, doors began to open, not from courage, but from desperation. The first patients came timidly: an old man with a fever, a boy whose leg had been wounded by shrapnel, a mother carrying a baby too weak to cry. They approached as though walking into the lion's den, unsure if mercy was a trap. The American doctors didn't speak Japanese, but kindness doesn't need translation. They smiled, gestured gently, and began their work. They cleaned wounds, offered water, shared rations, and wrapped shivering bodies in blankets that smelled faintly of a foreign land. The Japanese villagers watched in disbelief. These were supposed to be the monsters who had brought their world to ashes, and yet here they were, saving lives one by one. Word spread faster than wildfire. Within days, lines formed outside makeshift clinics. Mothers carried malnourished children, and old men came hobbling on bamboo sticks guided by neighbors. Some still looked frightened, but most carried something new in their eyes, a flicker of fragile hope. The Americans didn't discriminate. They treated soldiers and civilians alike, anyone who came in need. They gave away medical supplies that were meant for their own troops. They performed surgeries in the dim light of kerosene lamps, sweating under their uniforms as they worked through the night. The air inside those clinics smelled of antiseptic and humanity. Some Japanese doctors, hesitant at first, began to assist. Language barriers faded in the rhythm of shared purpose. A nurse would point, an American would nod, and together they would save another child. For the first time since the war's end, cooperation bloomed between two sides that had known nothing but hatred.
It was in these small acts, handing over a spoonful of powdered milk, holding a baby until it could breathe, that the shape of a new future began to form. One of the American nurses, a young woman named Mary, kept a journal. In one entry she wrote, "The mothers bow so deeply when we help them. It feels wrong to be thanked for something so simple. I wish they knew we're not heroes, we're just trying to make amends." Her words captured the quiet guilt many Americans carried. They knew what had happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They saw the burns that would never fade, the children whose eyes reflected both innocence and horror. And so their mission became more than medicine, it became penance. But for the Japanese mothers, it became something even greater: rebirth. They began to see these foreigners not as destroyers, but as healers sent by fate itself. One day, in a shattered village near Yokohama, an American doctor delivered a baby. The mother had been in labor for hours without proper care. Her husband had died in the war, and her family's home had been destroyed. She had walked miles to the clinic, half-conscious from exhaustion. When the baby was finally born, she broke into tears, not from pain, but from disbelief that her child had survived. The doctor, exhausted but smiling, placed the newborn in her arms. "She's strong," he whispered. The woman could not understand his words, but she understood his eyes. Later, she would write in her journal, "The enemy gave my daughter life. The sky outside was still gray, but for the first time I saw light." Similar stories unfolded across Japan. American aid workers distributed food rations, powdered milk, and vaccines. They taught hygiene to prevent disease, showed mothers how to prepare baby formula, and organized nutrition programs for children. In schools turned into clinics, Japanese women volunteered to help, learning basic nursing skills from the Americans. Over time, the fear that once filled every glance began to fade. Where there had been suspicion, there was now gratitude. Where there had been hate, there was now humility and connection. Children were often the bridge between both worlds. They would giggle when American soldiers offered them candy or toys. Their laughter, pure and unfiltered, broke the last walls of mistrust. The mothers watched their children interact with men in foreign uniforms, men who only weeks earlier they believed were devils, and realized that something extraordinary was happening. Hatred was unlearning itself. A U.S. Marine named Robert once knelt beside a crying boy who had lost his parents. He didn't know the language, but he offered the child his rations and gently patted his shoulder. The boy looked up with tear-streaked cheeks, then smiled faintly. That single smile broke the Marine's composure. He later wrote to his mother back home, saying, "Today I stopped being a soldier. Today I became a man who understands the cost of peace." As weeks turned into months, the Americans helped reopen hospitals and rebuild sanitation systems. The collaboration between Japanese and American medical staff deepened. There were no political speeches, no cameras to document the transformation, only quiet, selfless work done in the shadows of a broken world. But through those humble efforts, the foundation of modern Japan's recovery was being laid. For the mothers, the transformation was emotional and spiritual. Many had lost faith in humanity itself. Their grief was bottomless. Their prayers had turned to silence. But when they saw American doctors risk their own health to treat their children, something stirred within them, a feeling long buried under fear. Compassion had returned to the world, and it had come from the most unexpected place. Over time, letters and small gifts began to exchange hands. Mothers would bring rice balls or hand-sewn cloths as thanks even when they had little to give. The Americans accepted these gestures with tears in their eyes, humbled by the generosity of people who had nothing left. It was in these exchanges that mutual respect was born, not as an agreement, but as a feeling, unspoken, yet undeniable. Even the children began to mimic kindness. They would greet American nurses with small bows and giggles. Some tried to pronounce English words, and the nurses, in turn, learned Japanese phrases of affection: kawaii, daijobu, arigato. In those broken villages, a new language was being written, not of words, but of compassion, and it was universal. The wounds of war did not vanish overnight. Scars remained, on buildings, on bodies, and in memories. But within the hearts of those mothers, something miraculous was unfolding. They began to believe again that the future could hold more than sorrow. The fear that once kept them awake at night now began to fade with each dawn that brought medicine instead of bombs, laughter instead of screams. For the Americans, too, the experience changed everything. Many came to Japan believing they were serving duty, but they left believing they had witnessed grace. They saw the resilience of the Japanese people, their humility, their ability to forgive what seemed unforgivable. In helping others heal, the Americans healed something within themselves. Decades later, those who lived through that time still remembered the smell of disinfectant, the taste of rationed bread, the warmth of hands once foreign. The baby saved by the enemy grew up to become a nurse. The boy who smiled at the Marine became a teacher, telling his students about the day compassion triumphed over hatred. And the mothers who once feared death went on to raise a generation that would rebuild Japan, not through war, but through peace and cooperation. And all of it began with those moments when American doctors knelt beside their former enemies and said, without words, "You matter. Your life is worth saving." That was the true victory of 1945, not the surrender of a nation, but the awakening of humanity. In the ruins of conflict, two enemies discovered that mercy has more power than any weapon ever forged. And in the eyes of every child who lived because of that mercy, the future had already begun to change.
The real healing wasn't just physical, it was emotional. American nurses often held crying children, comforted grieving mothers, and listened. They brought vitamins, vaccinations, and medical care. But most importantly, they brought dignity. They taught hygiene, nutrition, and self-care, reminding the people of Japan that survival was not shameful, it was strength. In a land where loss had stripped people of their humanity, those nurses became a quiet force of rebirth. They walked through the remains of burned-out towns with their white uniforms stained by soot, their shoes sinking into the mud left by the monsoon rains, and their hearts heavy with compassion. They had come to heal wounds that could not be seen on the surface, the wounds carved into the human spirit by war, hunger, and humiliation. Many of these women were young, barely in their 20s, and yet they carried a maturity born from seeing too much suffering too soon. The Japanese people had always valued endurance, gaman, the silent bearing of hardship. It was seen as honorable to keep one's pain hidden, to bow one's head and continue on without complaint. But the war had tested even that stoic spirit. Mothers who had once smiled through hardship now sat in corners, hollow-eyed and silent, too weak to weep. Children wandered barefoot through the rubble, their ribs showing beneath torn shirts, their faces smudged with dirt. To these people, the arrival of American nurses felt like a distant dream. They came not as conquerors, but as caretakers, women whose gentleness seemed almost otherworldly after years of violence. They didn't just bring medicine, they brought presence. They touched the sick with warmth, not fear. They looked the Japanese mothers in the eyes, not down at them, not with pity, but with respect. In the temporary clinics and makeshift hospitals, the nurses worked tirelessly, often for days without proper rest. They boiled water over small stoves to sterilize equipment, prepared vaccines, and organized health workshops where Japanese women could learn basic sanitation and nutrition. At first, many mothers hesitated to attend. Shame held them back. Shame for being dependent on foreigners. Shame for their dirty clothes, their thin bodies, their broken pride.
But when they saw the nurses treating everyone equally, the elderly, the infants, even the beggars outside, the walls of embarrassment slowly began to crack. The nurses never asked for gratitude. Their actions spoke louder than any words could. They washed the faces of children, brushed away lice from their hair, and wrapped clean bandages around small wounds. Each gesture whispered a single message: "You deserve care. You deserve to live." One of the American nurses, her name was Ruth, became known in a small Tokyo neighborhood as the Lady with the Silver Smile. She always carried a small mirror, and when she finished cleaning a child's face or combing a girl's hair, she would show them their reflection and say softly, "Beautiful." The children would giggle, their eyes lighting up as if seeing themselves for the first time in years. To Ruth, this was more than kindness. It was restoration. She believed that to heal a nation, one must remind its people of their worth. A clean face, a fed stomach, a gentle word, these were her tools of resurrection. Many Japanese women were deeply moved by the humility of these foreigners. They noticed how the nurses would kneel to speak to the elderly, bow before entering rooms, and share their meals with patients. In doing so, they were unknowingly honoring Japanese customs, showing respect that transcended culture. Slowly, bonds began to form. The nurses started learning simple Japanese words: arigato for thank you, daijobu for it's okay. The mothers in turn taught them how to bow properly and how to greet elders. Through these small exchanges, two worlds that had once been divided by fear began to find harmony. Beyond physical treatment, the nurses focused on teaching. They believed that rebuilding Japan's future required more than medicine. It required knowledge. They taught the importance of clean water, of boiling utensils, of balanced meals made from what little food was available. They showed mothers how to purify water using charcoal, how to make simple disinfectants from alcohol and ash. They introduced new methods of childcare, explaining that malnutrition could be prevented with proper feeding, even in poverty. These lessons were not lectures. They were acts of empowerment. Every time a mother learned something new, she gained a fragment of control back over her life. She began to realize that survival was not shame. It was resilience, a quiet victory over despair. There was a deep emotional current that flowed beneath these encounters. Many of the nurses carried guilt. They had grown up during the war, hearing about the enemy across the ocean, and now they were looking into the eyes of those very people, people who had suffered under the consequences of decisions made far above them. They could not undo the past, but they could choose compassion in the present. And the Japanese mothers, who once thought their lives had ended, began to feel something unexpected: forgiveness. It didn't come easily, nor did it come all at once. But as they watched their children grow healthier, as they felt the touch of kindness instead of violence, the bitterness that had filled their hearts began to melt. In some villages, the nurses began organizing small gatherings. They encouraged the mothers to come together, share their experiences, and talk about their grief. These moments of sharing were revolutionary in a culture that prized silence over expression. Women began to cry openly, telling their stories: the loss of sons, the destruction of homes, the shame of begging for food. And when they finished, they found not judgment, but empathy. The nurses would listen, sometimes cry with them, and always remind them, "You are still strong. You are still mothers." These words became a lifeline, a mantra that carried them through the hardest days. Children who had been withdrawn began to laugh again. They played outside the clinics, chasing each other through the dust. The sound of laughter, once rare and fragile, became the rhythm of renewal. For the first time since the war's end, the air around those temporary hospitals was filled not with fear, but with life. And that life, as fragile as it was, kept growing. The emotional healing of Japan was not written in treaties or textbooks. It lived in those quiet exchanges between broken souls and gentle hands.
It lived in every mother who found the courage to try again, every child who dared to dream, every nurse who believed that compassion was stronger than war. By restoring the dignity of life, they gave Japan something no government could, a reason to believe in goodness again. As time passed, gratitude replaced fear. The Japanese people began to help the nurses, cooking meals for them, teaching them phrases, repairing their temporary shelters. The bond between them became a symbol of mutual respect, and when the American teams eventually left, they left behind more than medicine and training. They left behind a legacy of empathy. In the years that followed, Japan rose from its ruins, its hospitals rebuilt, its children healthy, its people renewed. Yet beneath that remarkable recovery lay the invisible foundation laid by those days of quiet compassion. The nurses had planted seeds of strength that no bomb could destroy. They taught a nation that survival is not about pride. It is about perseverance, kindness, and unity. They reminded mothers who had once felt worthless that to care for one's child, to keep living, to keep believing, was an act of victory in itself. The emotional healing of Japan outlasted the medicine. It echoed through generations. When the children of that era grew old, they told their grandchildren stories not only of pain, but of the people who helped them stand again. They spoke of women in white uniforms who arrived after the war, not as conquerors, but as angels. And in those stories lived a truth deeper than history, that even in the aftermath of destruction, humanity can rebuild itself one act of compassion at a time. The real healing of Japan was never about wounds closing or fevers breaking. It was about hearts learning to trust again. It was about a people rediscovering their dignity through the hands of strangers who treated them as equals. It was about mothers finding strength in survival and realizing that living, despite everything, was the bravest thing they could ever do. And so, from the ashes of war rose not only a new nation, but a new faith in the power of mercy, proving forever that kindness, once given, can heal the world.
Through compassion, trust began to grow. The same hands that once dropped bombs now delivered babies. The same uniforms, once feared, now symbolized hope. This transformation planted the first seeds of friendship between two nations that once swore never to forgive each other. The power of empathy began rewriting history, one healed life at a time. What happened in those quiet rooms, where American doctors and Japanese mothers faced one another for the first time, not as enemies, but as human beings, was something beyond politics, beyond war, beyond revenge. It was the slow rebirth of faith in humanity itself. The war had stripped away everything that defined life for these women: their homes, their husbands, their safety, even their sense of worth. Many of them had spent months hiding from air raids, clutching their children beneath shattered rooftops, praying for silence in the skies. When the bombing stopped, they emerged to find their cities unrecognizable and their spirits even more so. And yet, among the ruins, came people wearing the very insignia that once symbolized death. And instead of cruelty, they offered compassion. At first, many refused to believe it. Mothers would flinch when American soldiers approached, expecting punishment or humiliation. But what they received instead were bandages, milk, and medicine. Nurses would kneel beside them, softly touching the hands of those who trembled, as if reminding them that kindness had not died with the war. Slowly, Those small gestures began to stitch together something broken far deeper than any wound. A belief that maybe, just maybe, humanity could still exist even after so much hate. In one clinic in Yokohama, a young mother named Hana stood in line for hours, holding her feverish child. She was terrified, not just of the illness, but of the foreign faces waiting on the other side of the door. When she finally entered, an American nurse named Margaret smiled gently and motioned for her to sit. Without a word, she took the baby into her arms, checked his pulse, and wrapped him in a soft, clean blanket. Hana wept silently, not because of fear this time, but because someone cared. That scene repeated itself countless times across Japan, and every time it did, another wall of hatred fell. The mothers would return to their villages and whisper to others, "The Americans are not monsters. They saved my child." Word spread faster than propaganda ever could. What bullets and bombs could never achieve, kindness began to accomplish in silence. The American doctors weren't only fighting infections, they were fighting decades of distrust and despair. They understood that the rebuilding of Japan was not just a matter of concrete and steel, but of hearts and minds. They treated everyone equally, the rich, the poor, the old, the young. Some didn't even understand English, yet the universal language of compassion required no translation. A hand on the shoulder, a gentle nod, a clean bandage, these became the new vocabulary of peace. Children who once hid from soldiers began waving to them in the streets. Mothers started smiling again, and with each smile, the darkness of war faded a little more. For the Americans, too, this experience changed something inside. Many of them had seen the horrors of war firsthand, the burning cities, the screams, the endless death. To stand now among those same people, offering life instead of taking it, was an act of redemption. Some wrote in letters home that they finally felt they were doing something truly good. They began to see the Japanese not as enemies, but as fellow humans trying to survive just as they were. And that mutual recognition, the acknowledgement that pain and love exist on both sides, became the first true foundation of peace between the two nations. There were still challenges. Some older villagers refused treatment, clinging to bitterness. Others distrusted the food or medicine, fearing hidden intentions. But slowly, those fears melted away as results became visible. Children growing healthier, diseases declining, and hope returning. When an American midwife helped deliver a baby safely in a small coastal town, the villagers named the newborn Hikari, meaning light. It was a simple gesture, but a powerful one. That name symbolized everything this new era stood for. The light that came after darkness, born from hands that once brought destruction. Each story carried ripples far beyond the walls of those clinics. Families began rebuilding not just their homes, but their sense of belonging. Communities started planting again. Schools reopened, and laughter returned to the streets. Where there had been ruins, now there were gardens. Where there had been silence, now there were lullabies. It was as if kindness had become a seed, and everywhere it fell, life began to grow again. And at the heart of that transformation were the simple acts of care. The nurse who stayed up all night tending to a wounded child, the doctor who gave away his own rations to feed a patient, the translator who bridged two worlds with every word of comfort. The symbolism of those moments cannot be overstated. When the same hands that had once dropped bombs began delivering babies, it sent a message far more powerful than any speech or treaty ever could: that humanity has the capacity to rise from its worst moments and create something profoundly good. These American medical teams didn't just treat wounds, they restored dignity. They reminded the Japanese mothers that they were seen, that their pain mattered, that their children's lives were precious. And in return, the mothers taught the Americans something too: that forgiveness, even after unimaginable suffering, is possible. Years later, many of those children who were saved by American doctors would grow up to become leaders, teachers, and healers themselves. Some even joined exchange programs to the United States, driven by gratitude and curiosity about the people who had once been their enemies. One woman, whose mother's life was saved during childbirth by an American nurse, later became a midwife. She often told her students, "Kindness has no nationality. It heals faster than medicine." That was the legacy left behind. Not just hospitals and clinics, but a living bridge between two hearts once torn apart by war. When historians write about the post-war recovery of Japan, they often speak of economics, of politics, of reconstruction. But what they sometimes miss is that the true rebuilding happened in the quiet corners of human emotion. In the way a nurse wiped a child's tears, in the way a doctor bowed before a grieving mother, in the way two people who didn't share a language could still share compassion. Those moments rewrote history, not with treaties, but with tenderness. As months turned into years, that empathy deepened into something lasting. The Japanese people, once devastated, began to see that survival wasn't just endurance. It was a triumph of spirit. And the Americans realized that peace wasn't simply the absence of war. It was the presence of understanding. The same uniforms that had inspired terror became symbols of safety. When a convoy of American medical
In those hospitals and makeshift shelters, Japanese mothers learned to dream again. They chose to live not for themselves, but for the generations yet to come. Their children would grow up not in hatred, but in gratitude. These women became silent heroes, carrying forward the message that even after destruction, life can bloom again. Their courage was not the kind that demanded attention or applause. It was quiet, steady, and profoundly human. They had lost everything: homes, husbands, even faith. But somewhere between the cries of newborns and the gentle words of foreign nurses, they rediscovered purpose. To live was now an act of defiance, a statement that no bomb, no hunger, and no loss could erase the will to nurture life. In those dimly lit rooms where medicine was scarce and hope even scarcer, they began to whisper stories to their children. Stories not of war, but of peace, of rebuilding, of the promise that tomorrow could still be kind. Every blanket folded, every bowl of soup shared, every lullaby sung to a trembling infant was an act of resistance against despair.
These mothers carried a nation's wounds within their hearts, yet they smiled so their children could believe in sunlight again. They refused to let grief define them. Instead, they transformed pain into perseverance. They learned from the American nurses not only how to heal wounds, but how to care for their own souls again, how to wash away fear with compassion, how to replace bitterness with understanding. Their resilience became a quiet revolution, invisible to newspapers and cameras, but powerful enough to shape Japan's future. Outside those hospital walls, the world was still fragile. Cities were being rebuilt brick by brick, and food was still scarce. But inside, a different kind of reconstruction was happening, one built not from materials, but from emotions. The women began to form small groups, helping each other cook, sew, and care for the children of those who had no strength left. They taught each other to laugh again, to share memories, to believe that kindness was not weakness, but strength. When an American nurse showed a mother how to prepare milk safely for her newborn, it was more than a lesson. It was a gesture of trust, of connection. Slowly, those connections multiplied, weaving a delicate web of shared humanity that no weapon could destroy. As time passed, those same children who had been born under the care of American doctors began to take their first steps. Their laughter echoed through the ruins, a sound that once seemed impossible in a country haunted by silence and sorrow. The mothers would watch them play, their eyes filled with tears, tears not of grief, but of gratitude. They had seen death come too close, and now they were witnessing life pushing back. Each child represented a victory, a promise that Japan would rise again, not with weapons, but with wisdom earned from suffering. And those mothers, though nameless in history, became the true architects of that rebirth. Many of them began keeping journals, small notebooks hidden under tatami mats or in wooden drawers. In shaky handwriting, they recorded the transformation of their hearts. Some wrote about the first time they trusted an American doctor, others about the day they stopped fearing the sound of planes overhead. One woman wrote, "When I saw my child smile, I knew the war was finally over." Their words became private monuments to hope, testimonies that the human spirit, even when shattered, can rebuild itself with love. Years later, scholars would speak of Japan's economic miracle, of its rise from ashes to prosperity. But behind every statistic was a story of a mother who refused to give up. She was the one who stood in ration lines for hours so her children could eat. She was the one who walked miles to reach a clinic, clutching a feverish baby in her arms. She was the one who swallowed her tears so that her little ones would believe that everything would be all right. She was the invisible strength behind an entire nation's recovery. And though no medals were pinned to her chest, her courage was the kind that kept the world from collapsing. The American nurses, too, recognized the bravery of these women. They often spoke of how, despite hunger and exhaustion, the Japanese mothers carried themselves with quiet grace. They shared what little they had, bowing in gratitude for even the smallest kindness. Some American women later said that working among them changed their entire view of life, that they learned humility from those who had lost everything, yet still managed to smile. A bond formed between the two groups, transcending nationality and history. It was a sisterhood, born not of blood, but of shared humanity. As children grew, the mothers told them stories not of revenge, but of kindness. They wanted their sons and daughters to understand that peace was not given, it was built, one act of mercy at a time. They spoke about how the enemy had fed them, how the soldiers they feared had become protectors, how the same sky that once rained fire now watched over a world learning to forgive. Those stories became seeds planted deep in young hearts, seeds that would one day bloom into compassion, tolerance, and global understanding.
The next generation would carry within them a strange and beautiful inheritance, the memory of horror and the wisdom to choose peace instead. It wasn't easy. Trauma lingers. Many nights, mothers woke from dreams of air raids or the cries of loved ones lost. But when they looked at their children sleeping peacefully, they found the strength to move forward. Their survival was not merely endurance, it was an act of creation. They were crafting a new Japan, one built on empathy rather than pride, cooperation rather than conquest. They taught their children that true honor lies not in fighting, but in healing. That forgiveness, though difficult, is the only path that leads to lasting peace. And slowly that philosophy began to shape the soul of an entire nation. The post-war years were filled with contradictions, ruins standing beside new schools, grief mingling with hope. Yet in every corner the influence of these mothers could be felt. They became teachers, caregivers, and leaders within their communities. Some organized neighborhood cooperatives to share food and resources. Others volunteered at clinics, inspired by the nurses who once saved their children. Their small acts multiplied into movements, and those movements became the moral foundation of modern Japan. Without fanfare or recognition, these women built bridges where once there were walls. One story tells of a young widow named Keiko, who lost her husband in the war and nearly lost her newborn to malnutrition. An American doctor treated her child and gave her a job cleaning the hospital. Years later, she became a nurse herself. When asked why, she simply said, "Because someone once saved my baby without asking who I was." That single sentence captures the essence of that era, the power of compassion to transform not just lives, but entire destinies. For every Keiko, there were thousands of others who carried that same flame forward. The children raised by these mothers grew up with a unique understanding of the world. They were the generation that rebuilt Japan, guided by the quiet strength of their parents' sacrifices. They learned resilience from the women who refused to surrender, and kindness from the strangers who came to heal them. When they became adults, they carried those values into their work, their art, and their politics. They became the architects of peace treaties, the innovators who reshaped industries, the thinkers who redefined progress not as dominance, but as cooperation. Every achievement Japan made in the decades that followed was rooted in those early lessons of empathy and perseverance taught by mothers who had nothing left but love. In the soft light of those makeshift hospitals, life began again. Not just for individuals, but for a nation. The mothers didn't rebuild skyscrapers or factories, but they rebuilt the human spirit. They transformed fear into faith, loss into love, and despair into determination. They showed that the truest kind of heroism doesn't come from the battlefield, but from the cradle, from the choice to nurture when everything around you urges you to give up. Their legacy was not written in history books, but in the faces of their children, in the peace that now defines Japan's modern identity, and in the enduring friendship that blossomed between two once enemy nations. When we look back at that era, it's easy to focus on the generals, the treaties, the grand speeches. But the real story was written by the hands of mothers holding their children close amid the ruins. They didn't just survive, they restored the meaning of life itself. Their compassion became the quiet heartbeat of Japan's rebirth, a rhythm that continues to echo through generations.
What began as an act of mercy became a movement of humanity. Decades later, Japan and the United States stand as allies, proof that compassion can bridge even the deepest wounds. The lesson remains clear. War destroys nations, but kindness rebuilds humanity.
Those American doctors didn't just save lives, they restored faith in what it means to be human. What started in quiet clinics and makeshift tents, surrounded by rubble and grief, grew into a legacy that would reshape not only two nations, but also the very idea of what peace could mean. The story of Japan's rebirth is not only about reconstruction or economic revival, it is about the healing of souls through empathy. When the war ended, the world expected bitterness, rebellion, and endless resentment. Instead, something miraculous took place: forgiveness. It didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen in the halls of power. It began in the smallest gestures, in a nurse's touch, a doctor's kindness, a child's laughter echoing in a ward that once held only silence. Those moments, invisible to history books, were the foundation upon which a new world would quietly be built. For the Americans who came to Japan, the mission was supposed to be simple: provide medical aid, distribute food, and stabilize a broken population. But what unfolded was far more profound. Many of the soldiers and doctors who arrived carried the trauma of battle in their own hearts. They had seen destruction, participated in it, and now found themselves surrounded by its aftermath. The sight of starving children, of mothers with hollow eyes and trembling hands, forced them to confront the true cost of war, not in numbers or victories, but in the fragile faces of survivors. In those moments, uniforms ceased to matter. Rank disappeared. What remained was something deeply human: a shared sense of suffering and the unspoken realization that mercy was the only path forward. The Japanese people, in turn, responded with dignity. Despite hunger, humiliation, and loss, they did not turn away from those who came to help. Instead, they opened their hearts, slowly and cautiously, learning that the same hands once feared could now be trusted. This mutual rediscovery of humanity became the seed of reconciliation. As doctors treated wounds, they unknowingly began to heal something far larger: the spiritual fracture between two nations. They didn't just cure infections, they restored dignity. They didn't just hand out rations, they offered hope. The simplest acts became symbols of rebirth: a bowl of rice, a blanket for a shivering child, a smile exchanged between former enemies. Each gesture chipped away at the walls that hatred had built. In the decades that followed, those small seeds grew into trees whose roots reached deep into the soil of both nations. Japan and America, once enemies locked in unimaginable destruction, became partners, economically, politically, and culturally. Their alliance would go on to shape the modern world, influencing art, science, technology, and diplomacy. But behind every handshake between leaders and every signed agreement lay the invisible legacy of those first doctors, nurses, and civilians who chose compassion over revenge. They proved that true power lies not in domination, but in understanding. That peace is not negotiated at the end of a war, it is built, person by person, through acts of kindness that refuse to die. Generations later, many Japanese families still tell stories of the Americans who came not to conquer, but to care. Some elderly women still remember the first time they tasted milk or received penicillin, describing it as a miracle. Others recall the way the doctors bowed before them, showing respect in a way that shattered expectations. To a population once taught to see Americans as monsters, these moments redefined everything. Children grew up hearing stories not of hatred, but of healing. In schools, lessons shifted from military obedience to international cooperation. In homes, mothers taught their children that kindness could cross oceans. Slowly, an entire culture began to evolve, embracing the idea that peace is not weakness, it is wisdom. The ripple effects spread beyond Japan. The world watched as two former enemies turned into allies, and nations still recovering from their own wars took notice. The American humanitarian efforts in Japan became a blueprint for how compassion could succeed where politics often failed. Programs that began as temporary relief evolved into long-term partnerships in education, trade, and cultural exchange. Universities in both countries established joint research centers. Artists and writers explored themes of forgiveness and rebirth. Even Hollywood and Japanese cinema began exchanging ideas, producing works that celebrated empathy over enmity. The healing that started in hospitals had now reached the stage of history. And yet, what made this transformation truly remarkable was how deeply personal it remained. Every story, every life saved, every act of mercy was part of something larger, but it was always rooted in individual hearts. The American nurse who comforted a mother after childbirth could not have known that decades later her kindness would echo through generations. The Japanese doctor trained by American mentors would go on to open clinics that continued the cycle of care. The children who grew up during that time, once victims of war, became ambassadors of peace. They studied abroad, married across cultures, and raised children who saw the world not in terms of us and them, but as one shared humanity. It's easy, in retrospect, to view this alliance as inevitable, but at the time it was far from that. The wounds were deep, the anger real, the memories still raw. What overcame all of that wasn't diplomacy or military strength, it was empathy. When one nation chose to help its former enemy rather than punish it, it defied history itself. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, but in Japan, something even more profound occurred: the rebuilding of the human heart. That lesson would echo in future generations of global humanitarian efforts, from disaster relief missions to peacekeeping operations, reminding the world that the surest way to create an ally is to show compassion in their darkest hour. Over the years, many of the American doctors and nurses who served in post-war Japan returned home, forever changed by what they had witnessed. They spoke at universities and conferences, not about medicine, but about humanity. Some became advocates for peace, arguing that the success of their mission proved that mercy was the most effective antidote to hatred. Others returned to Japan in later years, welcomed as honored guests by the very people they had once treated. There were tears, embraces, and shared memories that transcended words. One doctor, upon visiting a now thriving Tokyo hospital decades later, said quietly, "I came here to heal the wounded. Instead, they healed me." This exchange of compassion created something rare and sacred: mutual respect. Japan did not lose its identity through this friendship, it rediscovered it. The discipline, honor, and resilience that had once fueled its military machine were now redirected towards creation, innovation, and peace. America, too, was transformed. Its experience taught it that leadership in the modern world was not about control, but about care. Together, they demonstrated that the only kind of power that lasts is the power to uplift. When we look at the alliance between Japan and the United States today, economic partners, cultural collaborators, and defenders of peace in a turbulent world, it's easy to forget that it all began in the ashes of one of history's darkest chapters. But beneath the modern skyline of Tokyo, beneath the neon lights and bustling streets, there still lingers the quiet memory of that time when mercy changed everything. Every act of cooperation, every shared innovation, every treaty signed in friendship can trace its lineage back to a moment when one human being reached out to another and compassion triumphed over vengeance. In the end, the legacy of those American doctors and nurses is not measured in numbers or monuments, but in the moral architecture they helped build.
They reminded the world that every act of kindness ripples outward, reshaping history in ways we can't always see. Their story stands as a timeless testament to the strength of empathy, a strength far greater than any army, far more enduring than any weapon. They proved that even when nations fall apart, humanity can still be rebuilt from the ground up, one healed soul at a time. As the decades rolled on, the friendship between the two countries deepened. Students exchanged letters and later visits. Veterans returned, not to fight, but to remember. The children of
What began as an act of mercy became a movement of humanity. Decades later, Japan and the United States stand as allies, proof that compassion can bridge even the deepest wounds. The lesson remains clear. War destroys nations, but kindness rebuilds humanity. Those American doctors didn't just save lives, they restored faith in what it means to be human. When hatred ends, humanity begins. The day Japanese mothers found hope again was the day the world learned that healing can come, even from the hands once called the enemy. From despair came compassion. From war, peace.